Well, good evening, everyone. So today for our noon time, we're going to talk about the issue of racism. We're going to address the fact that if everything is racist, then nothing is racist. And we're going to talk about why that's important. So before we get into what we're going to look at, let's talk about from this one, and you have to realize I represent one of several million Black men in America. But from this one Black man's perspective, when we're talking about issues of racism, the thing that concerns me are issues like the fact that in interactions with law enforcement and interactions with people in general, that my children, I've got 3 boys, they're little boys now, they're going to be teenagers and they're going to be young men. And in the society that we live in now, the perception of threat is going to be greater for them than for their white counterparts. My sons will be perceived as a greater threat than their white counterparts. And we need to address that. When we look at things like prison sentencing and how sentencing guidelines seem to unfairly skew in one direction when it comes to people of color, we need to address that. Those are important things. Those are things that are major issues. I would even, now this isn't an issue of racism, but I would even say we need to address the whole issue of private prisons in general. And there are so many other issues that are our issues of racism, that are issues of white supremacy that we need to address. But if we turn Band-Aids racist, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's this thing out there about Band-Aids and the color that they choose for Band-Aids. If we start turning Band-Aids racist, and if we start turning everything racist, then nothing is going to be racist. If we look at history, we look at our founding fathers. Was George Washington a slave holder? Yes, actually, if we look at the founding fathers, the majority of them were. But we take the good with the bad. I don't have a problem with addressing the fact that they were slaveholders. If we also address and admit to the fact that the nation that we have today, which is by far better than it was just 60 years ago, so much better than it was 200 years ago, we wouldn't have if it wasn't for our founding fathers. Did they have their issues? Oh, yes, they did. All of them. And guess what's going to happen? We're going to have great people in history today that 200 years from now, if people look at, they're going to say, oh boy, did they have their issues. You know why? Because we all do. And there are things that we do in our society that we try to do to benefit minorities. One of the things that I used to have an issue with, but I don't have an issue with if it's done right, is affirmative action. Affirmative action is not a bad thing if it's done correctly, because all what it's saying is that we want to have a diverse group of individuals within our workplace, within our school, but it needs to be done correctly. So let me give you an example. We're going to just pick a generic college, and that college has a requirement on the ACT of 25. You have to write an essay, and you have and the minimum GPA is a 3.3 GPA. You have a Black student and you have a white student. If that Black student has the 3.3 GPA, scores the 25 on the ACT, submits the essay, and it comes down to that black student and that white student, and you say, I want to choose that black student because we want more diversity in our department, everything else being equal, then that's fine. Where I run into a problem is if that black student has a 23 on the ACT, well, it didn't meet your requirements. You said it had to be a 25. So don't lower the requirements, all things being equal. Or let's just say that the black student meets the requirements, 25 on the ACT, knocked out the essay, 3.3 GPA, and the white student has a 3.5 GPA, and they scored a 27 on the ACT. But you say, you know what, we want a little bit more diversity in our department. Okay, that's fine to choose the black student now, even though the scores are lower. He met your requirements, but don't lower the requirements. Those are some of the issues that trouble me. I'm going to share my screen here. And this was a poster that was printed on the website of the museum, the African American History Museum. Now, there's some things that I want to say that are good and some things I want to say that are bad about this. The premise, when we look at it, is problematic. What I want to say about the museum, though, is that although I don't think they should have ever posted this, that they did take it down, they did apologize, and so let's move on. In our cancel culture that we live in today, it's like, oh no, we have to make them pay. No, they were adult about this. They took it down and they made their apology. And the fact of the matter is, as we see as we go through this, the reason that they put it up in the first place is they wanted to start a discussion. That was a good thing. And we're going to also see that if we look at this objectively, there are good points in here that we need to address. But overall, not the best. And we're going to look at this from our standpoint as Americans. And of course, I'm a Christian. And so I'm going to look at it from a Christian perspective as well. So let's just jump into it and start by what it says the purpose of this is. White dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways that white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over the time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, we have an internalized to some aspect of white culture, including people of color. And that's true. But that is true in any society. If you go to Japan, which for the most part is homogenous in terms of the culture there, it's Japanese culture is going to be predominant. If you go to China, Chinese culture is going to be predominant. For the majority of the existence of this country and countries in Europe, white culture has been what is predominant. And so, yes, white culture is the culture that has shaped much of the way we live. Now, that doesn't mean that minority cultures have not had their influence, because I think, especially if you look at popular culture, things such as fashion and music and movies, you will see the influx of minority cultures. However, that influence has not gone into the power or the political structure as well yet. And that is something that we would want to address. But let's look at what they consider to be white culture and talk about some of the things where they may have been right and some of the things where they are wrong, and how we as Christians should address it as well. First of all, rugged individualism. The individual is the primary unit. Self-reliance. Independence and autonomy are highly valued and rewarded. Individuals assume to be in control of their environment. You get what you deserve. Okay, I don't know that I'm going to say that that is an aspect of just European or white culture. I will say that from a Christian standpoint, this has its issues, because as Christians, we understand that we are not to be It is not about independence, it is about interdependence. We are supposed to depend on each other. We are supposed to be able to lean on each other. It is not about just the individual. And the fact is, you don't always get what you deserve. Sometimes people who don't deserve things get them, whether they're good or they're bad. And so we have to admit to that. We have to accept that. And so I look at this rugged individualism. Is this a part of white culture? I honestly, with this one, I can't say. When I look at history, when I look at other nations and how they operate, for instance, when you look at the Far East, I do have to admit that there is not as great a focus on the individual, and there is a more of a focus on the collective. So there may be something to this, but what we have to understand is that there's more to it than the individual. And from a Christian perspective, we are more collective. Family structure. So it says the nuclear family, father, mother, 2.3 children. How you get a third of a child, I don't know, is the ideal social unit. Husband is the breadwinner and the head of the household. Wife is the homemaker and subordinate to the husband. Children should have own rooms and be independent. I do not know that last one. I don't know where that came from, because that might be a middle class or an upper middle class or a rich way of looking at things. But you look at the lower middle class and you look at the poor, and each child having their own room. It doesn't. I had my own room. I was the only child though. And the nuclear family. This is not whiteness. This is just the way that the world has evolved over time. You see the nuclear family in cultures everywhere. Now, granted, you have some cultures where the family is a husband and 1, 2, 3 wives, and there's that culture. But the family, and especially, again, looking at it from a Christian standpoint, because it's going to address religion a little bit later, the family it's the foundation of culture. And it's not whiteness, it's not white supremacy to say, if I go to other countries where the predominant skin color is not white, I'm still going to see in most of the world this type of family structure, father, mother, children. When we look at it just biologically, let's just look at the biological makeup, that the race does not perpetuate if you do not have father and mother. And we're just saying that you have father and mother, and the best situation is when that father and that mother are together raising those children. That's not whiteness. That's the way things are, and it is the way things should be, in my opinion. Now, of course, there will be people that have different opinions. But to say that the family and the structure of the family is whiteness, I believe they were mistaken here. Emphasis on scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis. And I will point to you that when you look again at history, that though they did not call it the scientific method as we called it, when you look at places like Egypt, when you look at places like China, they were doing this without naming it. So to say that the emphasis on the scientific method is whiteness is to say that the white culture is the only culture that engages in good science. That makes no sense to me. That makes zero sense to me. But if we look historically, again, go back, look at what was happening in some of those those Western African nations. Look at what was happening in the Far East, and you see this objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect, quantitative emphasis going on. They just didn't name it. They hadn't named it the scientific method yet. So no, I do not see this as whiteness history. Now, here's where we're going to come to some points of agreement. When we look at what we learn about history in our schools, let's see if what they say is true. It's based on Northern European immigrants' experience in the United States. Primarily, whether we want to admit it or not, that is true. Heavy focus on the British Empire. That is true. We don't learn as much about some of these other nations. Now, of course, that's because we as a nation are descended from the British Empire, but that is true. The primary Western, Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian traditions, and all of that is true. And there are some criticisms that can go with that because the world is more and involves more than just this viewpoint. The hard thing is that it's hard to overcome this because one of the things that I learned as one who taught history is that if you look at a history book from any country, they are going to always be the hero. If I remember studying World War II and looking at a Canadian history book, and in an American history book, everything is about Utah Beach when we talk about the storming of the beach on Normandy. Yeah, we mentioned Sword and Juneau and those other beaches, but everything's about Utah because that is the beach that the United States was primarily responsible for. You look in a Canadian book, they mention Utah, but they speak more towards Juneau because that is where the Canadian troops were. This is just something that we as human beings do, but it doesn't excuse it. We can overcome it. Do we need to learn more about how history is seen through the eyes of our neighbors to the south in Mexico? Do we need to know about how history is perceived, especially history during those Middle Age times? How is it perceived in Persian countries? How is it perceived in the Middle East? How is it perceived in the Far East? We do, and we would learn, I believe, more from that perspective rather than seeing history only through a primarily European lens. And that is what, it's uncomfortable, but that is a truth that we have to wrestle with. So we find agreement on this one. Protestant work ethic. Hard work is the key to success. Work before play. If you don't meet your goals, you didn't work hard. So let's talk about the first two. That's not whiteness. I mean, come on. Cultures everywhere. You think we talk about working hard? Again, let's go back to the Far East. Let's look at Japanese culture. You think we talk about working hard? You think we have pressure? You want to talk about pressure? That's not whiteness. That, to me, that's common sense. Yes, if you work hard, most of the time you will be successful. The argument here is probably that there are some people who work hard that aren't, and that's true. But the bottom line is very few people, unless you're born rich or something, that don't work hard receive success. And a lot of people, most people who do work hard receive success. So that's not whiteness. Work before play. Yeah, get your work done and then party hard. Get your work done and have a good time. That's not whiteness. That's common sense. Now, let's go to the third one. If you didn't meet your goals, you didn't work hard. I wouldn't say that that's whiteness. I wouldn't say that that's the work ethic. And I also wouldn't say that's right. Because there are some people who work really hard who don't achieve. There is a such thing, and people don't like to hear this. There is a such thing as luck, and there's a such thing as advantages, having advantages because of the place and the skin and the educational level that you were born into. Religion, Christianity is the norm. Anything other than Judeo-Christian tradition is foreign. No tolerance for deviation from single God concept. I would say that that is also, and okay, Christian here. So, but I think that when you look at us as a nation, let's just look at the United States. We are extremely tolerant by comparison to other nations in terms of how we accept other religions. Now, most people would say, yeah, okay, so we accept Islam, we accept Judaism, but those are all monotheistic religions. I grew up in Detroit, and we had one of the largest Hindu temples in the country, right there in Detroit. Buddhism is studied by a large number of people within this country. I would say that we are, when it comes to religion, we are extremely tolerant. I would say that I feel that we're becoming less tolerant of religion in general, and that means we're becoming more secular. That's a problem for me, of course. But to say that the Christian religion, in which, let me just remind you about the Christian religion. The Messiah, Jesus Christ, is Jewish. If you look at our Bible, the majority of our Bible was written by a man named Paul, who was Jewish. And the Old Testament was written by people who were Jewish. They were not white. And I understand that when we see what the skin tone of many Jews is today, we think that. But that's not the case. So I would have to argue about Christianity being whiteness. Status, power, and authority. Okay. Wealth equals worth. Your job is who you are. Respect authority. Heavy value on ownership of goods and space and property. This is a major issue. And I would say that this is something that is, I don't want to say uniquely American, but more American than European, because Europeans seem to have, at least now, be moving away from this. So if we were to say that this is a European and thus white value, you could probably have an argument there. And there are some issues here, because your wealth is not your worth. You are so much more than your job. I would say we should respect authority. Absolutely. We should respect authority. Respecting authority doesn't mean that we don't question authority, though. And that's part of the problem I think we see. It is seen as disrespectful to question authority. That's not the case. We can respect authority and question authority when we think that there's some issues. Why are you doing this? That's okay. Heavy value on ownership's goods, space, and you know, we can't escape that. We live in a consumeristic society. And I mean, there's not a whole lot I can say about that. We definitely do live in a consumeristic society. That is a problem. We need to try and change that way of thinking. And I have seen it change. I have seen us start to make adjustments, especially in the younger generation. So there's hope. Future orientation. Plan for the future. Delayed gratification. Progress is always best. Tomorrow will be better. I can't speak to that last one because I don't know. I haven't seen that, feel it, that tomorrow will be better. And not only white people aren't the only people who plan for the future. Again, look at some of the ancient cultures. We just went through back in 2012, this whole thing about the Mayan calendar and the world was coming to an end. People planned for the future before Europeans came to power. This is not whiteness. Delayed gratification. Well, I would argue that that is not even an American value. that delayed gratification. And the reason I would argue that is because if we have a heavy value on ownership of goods and space and property, and we're consumeristic, then how do we also have delayed gratification? I believe personally in delayed gratification, but I do not see that as an American value at all. I wish that it were more so the case. Progress is always best. Again, I would say that there is a segment of the country that believes that, and they have progress in their name, but I don't see that as a uniquely American value. Now, here's one that I really have problem with: time. Okay, this to me just got crazy. Time. Follow a rigid time schedule, time viewed as a commodity. For the most part, basically. White people out there, did you all know that you invented time? I got nothing. No. As a matter of fact, the first clock was not invented by a European. You don't believe me? Look it up. The first clock was not invented by a European. And following a rigid time schedule, oh boy, I could have some stories about how we don't. Time is viewed as a commodity. I will say that, more so than probably it should be. But cultures were doing time and doing schedules long before European powers rose to power. Okay, I'm going to butcher this word, but aesthetics based on European culture, speak, steak and potatoes, bland is best. I don't see American food as bland. I've eaten food from other countries. Women's beauty is based on blonde, thin Barbie. No, 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 no. If that's the case, why do we get so many blonde jokes? And Barbie isn't as thin as she used to be. Man's attractiveness is best on economic status, power, and intellect. And here's the thing with these. These are all preferences, though. And I can tell you that this is not my preference. And I can think of a lot of white people that it's not their preference. I can't speak to women's preferences. I'm not a woman. So I think that there was a time when this was probably more true than it is now. So I'm not going to jump down their throat for it. The bland is best. I don't know what you talk about. We put salt on everything. Everything. Read a label. We oversalt things. Holidays based on Christian religion. Why? Because the majority of the people in the country were Christian. That has nothing to do with whiteness. The majority of the people in the, if you go to Israel, where are the majority of the holidays going to be? They're going to be Jewish holidays. Why? Because it's a Jewish country. It has nothing to do with whiteness. Based on white history and male leaders. Yeah, that's true. For the most part, we did get Martin Luther King Day, and we get Black History Month. But I think that over time that is going to change, and I think it will change as we get more people of color into the power structure. But I can't disagree with a lot of our holidays, again, being based on white history and male leaders. I will say this, those of you who have a problem with it, I'm sorry, but would you please leave Mother's Day and Father's Day alone? Leave Mother's Day and Father's Day alone. You want to go after President's Day, that's fine. You want to go after, leave Memorial Day and Veterans Day alone too. President's Day, okay, you want to go after some of those other holidays, leave Mother's Day and Father's Day alone. Some of us, I didn't grow up with a father, but I have people who I honor as my father. So we'll just leave it at that. Justice based on English common law. Yes, it is. And that's not a bad thing because it's a darn good system. Protect property and entitlement. Yeah, I want you to protect the stuff I own. Um, intent counts. Yeah, yeah. I don't see a major issue with that. Although this is where I'm going to get in trouble. I do have a problem with, for instance, hate crime, because we're talking about intent counting here. Now, here's the reason I have a problem with hate crime. Let's say that someone goes out today and they murder someone, and the reason that they murdered that person is because of the color of their skin. Let's say that a guy comes home and he finds his wife with another man, and he doesn't do anything right then. He plans it out, and a month later he kills both his wife and this other man. Is the fact that he did not do that based on race, is that better? Because the person who kills someone based on their race, that gets more time than this man who took the time to sit down and plan out the murder of his wife and her lover. They're both murders. They're both murders in which you thought about it and you planned it out. And I believe punishment should be equal for that. Is our justice system based on European culture? Yes. I would agree 100% with that. Now we can have a discussion about it. I would say, though, I don't have a problem with it, because I think I think when it's applied properly and done right, it's a darn good justice system. Compensation, be number one, win at all costs, winner loser dichotomy, action oriented, master and control nature, must always do something about a situation, aggressiveness and extroversion, decision making, majority rules when whites have power. No, let's stop. Let's go with my majority rules. We have this thing here. Let's talk about presidential elections, because it's been being talked about for the last 4 years. And as a former government teacher, it's something that I like to address. We have an electoral college. We have had an electoral college since the inception of the nation. That's not majority rules. That is a Republican style system, not Republican as in Republican Party, but Republican as in a republic. And it's the way it is set in place, it gives power to smaller states that are not, if we had a majority rule system, basically California, New York, Texas, Florida, those would be the states that pretty much would set policy for the entire country. They don't. So we don't really have a majority rules when whites are in power. We don't have a majority rules system. That's not the system that we have as a political system. I don't know exactly what they're talking about with decision making, except for that, yeah, you should make decisions. I would say that we do focus on extroversion, and I say that as an introvert. Yeah, it's annoying. Must always do something about a situation. That is common thought, so I would agree with that as well. Master and control nature, I don't know what that, I can't speak to that. Action oriented, definitely, I can't disagree with that as either. Winner loser dichotomy. But here's the thing, that's fact. It's not always the case that someone wins and someone loses. There can be middle ground in certain situations. In November, we're going to have a presidential election. What's going to happen? Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. When we play sports, you play sports because somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. In a lot of situations, that's the case. Now, I will say what we have to do a better job of is teaching that that's not always the case. Sometimes everybody can win. There's sometimes when everybody might lose. But to try and get away from the fact that in many cases there are winners and losers, we can't. We just need to nuance it and teach that sometimes, and I would say most times, there is there's something in the middle. But I also am not a big, I will admit, I'm not a big fan of participation trophies and ribbons either. Win at all cost. I believe that that is not as true as it used to be, but there was a time when it was. And yeah, be number one. Let's just face it. We do have to admit one thing, that when it comes to especially world politics, we as Americans are incredibly arrogant. We're number one. And I can tell you, having dealt with people from other countries, yeah, it is annoying. And so we need to work on that. We are number one in a lot of things. We're good in a lot of things, but there are certain things that other countries are better than us at. I would argue, again, going to the Far East, that if we look at the latter half of the 20th going into the 21st century, if they are not better than us, the Japanese are just as good as us when it comes to innovation. And let's close this out. Let's talk about communication. The King's English rules. Yes, it does, because most of the people in our country speak English. If you go to France, guess what rules? French. If you go to Iran, what rules? Farsi. If you go to China, what rules? Mandarin. What's the problem with that? Yes, you need a common language to be able to communicate. The King's English rules in the United States because we speak English. The King's English rules in Britain because they speak English. French rules in France because they speak French. Come on. What's the problem? That's not whiteness. That's just the language that the majority of the country speaks. Written tradition. Yeah, although let me tell you, that one's going away. Avoid conflict and intimacy. More so than other countries, yes, I will agree with that. I'm going to tell you, I don't particularly have a problem with it, because I will be intimate with the people I want to be intimate with, and with the people I don't want to be intimate with, it's none of your business. I don't avoid conflict as much as I used to. And I think as a country, we might be getting better at that one. Don't show emotion. Again, not as true as it used to be. It did used to be a lot more true than it is. Look at culture, because culture, your culture tells you, when you look at popular culture, it tells you what's popular. And you got people showing emotions everywhere. Look on Twitter, look on Facebook. This is not as true as it used to be. Don't discuss your personal life. You can, but why? Again, not something that I see as true. I have a wife that I guess must have an approachable face, because we are in line at Walmart and people will start telling her their life story within 2 minutes of talking to her. So I don't see this. I kind of wish that people would discuss a little bit less personal stuff when I'm first meeting you. Don't, and be polite. What's wrong with that? That's not whiteness. That's just being nice. It's not being a butthole. What's wrong with being polite? What's wrong with being civil? That's not white. Other societies are polite societies. The United States and Europeans are not the only people who are polite. Come on. So, as you can see, there are some things here that I would agree with, that are a predominant part of white culture, but there are a lot of things that I don't. And the bottom line here is that when this was posted by the African American History Museum, what I just did is what they wanted to happen. They wanted to have a discussion. But putting something like this up doesn't necessarily foster discussion. It inflames people. And so that's what we ended up dealing with. So just to review, rugged individualism might be a part of a strong part of European culture. The family structure existed before European culture, as did the scientific method. When we look at history, yes, we are looking at history from a Eurocentric lens, and we need to work on that. The work ethic is not necessarily just a Protestant work ethic. It's just a work ethic. Yes, Christianity is the norm within the United States, but we are very accepting of other religions, especially when you look at us in comparison to other countries. Status, power, and authority. Yes, I would see some issues with that, but I don't necessarily know that that is whiteness, as more so. I think it's just people of power generally behave the same way, regardless of what nation they might be from. Future oriented, I don't necessarily agree that that is something that is pervasive in our country anymore. Time has existed since it started. Aesthetics, we do have some issues with aesthetics. Holidays, yes, our holidays are mostly Christian and they're mostly white, simply based on the where the nation, how the nation was founded, and the majority of the people in the nation. Do we want? But I will say this: I didn't mention this other. We do respect the holidays of other people. They just aren't a major part of our culture because the majority of people don't celebrate them. Competition, well, justice. I would agree that yes, our justice system is a European style justice system, but I think that's good. I don't disagree with that. Competition, we do have some issues with competition, but we also have to be realistic about how that life, there is competition in life, not only just human life, in life in general. Communication, yes, we do communicate in English, but that's because that's what most of us speak, and that's not unusual in any country. Uh, Countries have languages, and that's what they primarily speak. And of course, the bottom line here: be polite. Yeah, what's the problem with being polite? I think that we all should be, I hope that I was polite in the way that I broke down this uh, sheet here, but we just need to be careful. Everything can't be white. Whites did not create everything in the world that is either good or bad. Uh, and if everything is racism, if everything is whiteness, then nothing is racism and nothing is white. So let's have the discussion, and let's make sure that we're focusing on those things that are most important. With that, may the Lord keep you and may the Lord bless you. May heaven continue to smile upon you and grant you peace. God bless you. Until we meet again.